Welcome to another episode of the Robinson Hewitt Pod. This is where we talk about the future of technology and what it means to be human in the next era of tech. I'm your host, Alison Mackey. I'm a futurist, anthropologist of emerging technology, and founder of Robinson Hewitt Consulting. Welcome. So when I was really little and I would sit on my bedroom floor, I would take out our giant VHS camera, and with my collection of Barbies, which was quite extensive, I would produce these little films. And eventually I would shyfully try to write out scripts for these little films that I was creating. But as a 6-year-old, I think I only managed to produce a title and a few stick figures to express the story that I wanted to tell. But I just knew that I had stories that I needed to put somewhere. And oddly, this carried into high school, where my friend and I would spend our entire weekends writing scripts, filming around Dunedin, and submitting our films to little festivals. And we did the same thing with Sims. We would spend hours building up these little simulations, recording them as if they were real. And then later on, we would edit those little clips and make them into short stories. And then again, this carried into university, where my friends and I would submit to 48-Hour Film Festival. And nobody has seen the light of days of those films. And I don't think there's ever been an audience for them except for ourselves. But there has always been this compulsion to make something and see all the different ways that we could tell stories. And I don't think this is a pattern just in my own life, but this has been the case since the beginning of time, of how we tell stories. And I think the release of Christopher Nolan's translation of the Odyssey that is coming out this week is perfect timing, because as a classicist, I thought that it would be perfect to talk about the next evolution in how we tell stories, how we entertain ourselves, and the future of film and movies this week. Because I think a lot about where the future of entertainment is going. Because what I was doing at 6 years old with a VHS camera is no different to a teenager with their phone today. The tools have changed, but the compulsion hasn't. And that space between our urge to tell stories and the speed at which technology underneath it is also moving is what this episode is all about. So let's get into the future of entertainment, movies and film, and our human need to be entertained and share our stories. So the future of storytelling is one of the most interesting questions of this era, because I think we've had a lot of legacy and impactful studios, directors, and stories being told at the moment, and the technology underneath it all is really showing why it's so impactful. But of course, we also talk a great deal about what AI is doing to our jobs, but really what it's doing to art and this irreplaceable act of being human and making meaning through stories, or being entertained, or just simply creating. That question sits at the intersection of technology, anthropology, and something that is so much harder to kind of pin down. And it really does touch on our souls as being human. So right now, the entertainment industry is in the middle of several shifts and disruptions, and none of them are moving in linear directions. So we've seen an increase in Hollywood writers and actors strikes, and they weren't just labor disputes. So we've seen the first major civilizational negotiations over what human creative work is worth in the age of generative AI. We've seen studios that have been selling off lots, and the economics of streaming are shifting back towards advertising. And then at the same time, the teenager with a phone and a great idea can now reach a global audience with production values that 10 years ago would have required a professional crew. So the barrier to entry for creation is lower than it has ever been in the history of storytelling. And that's not small. This is one of the big shifts and evolutions that looks incremental until it isn't. And at the top end of the industry, in this week alone, is something that is so interesting, because Christopher Nolan just shot an entire feature film on IMAX for a story that is 3,000 years old. And Pixar's Andrew Stanton, who has recently directed Toy Story 5, is also talking publicly about AI and what it means for the artists in his studio. And these are the people and the companies who have been at the frontier of what cinema and emerging technology can do. And they're actively working out what the next chapter looks like. So this week alone is huge for this, which is so exciting. But still, there's two camps forming. And I think it's worth being honest about where the contrast lives within this space. Because on one side, many see technology as liberation, as a tool that frees artists to be more artistic. Yet on the other hand, others see technology as a form of erosion, as a force that shortcuts the very process that produces creative work. And I don't think either camp has it right or wrong. I think there's space for both. But in order to take a look into the future, we need to take a little look back in time to notice the patterns. So technology has always been a part of storytelling since storytelling began. You could think about it as us sitting around the fire to tell stories, or even thinking about the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Greeks were using mechanical technology on stage, from trapdoors, pulley systems, and cranes that lowered actors playing gods from above the stage. And the word we still use for a convenient narrative resolution, deus ex machina, it literally translates to to God from the machine. They had a machine and they were using it to tell better stories. And the audiences were, by all accounts, wildly entertained. And then we can also think about Shakespeare's Globe, which was a masterpiece in acoustic engineering. So the thrust stage, the yard, the galleries, all of it were designed so that the human voice could carry meaning to every single person in that space, regardless of where they were standing. That is a technology problem that was solved in a service of a storytelling need. But of course, we also have the Greeks to thank for the design of the amphitheater that came before that. But when cinema arrived, theater didn't die. It adapted, and cinema became the new frontier of what was possible, from silent films to talkies to black and white and to Technicolor. And these advancements would have been so amazing to watch in real time. And then our television sets finally arrived in our homes, and cinema didn't die. It adapted, and television became something entirely different. It became a medium of long-form intimacy for stories that lived in your living rooms over years. And now with streaming services and our personal devices, we can take our daily commute and bring these stories with us wherever we go. So each new medium didn't replace what came before it. It just created new space, and in doing so, it forced the older form to become even more purely itself. And this pattern repeats so consistently across history that I think we should take it more seriously as a predictive signal. So new mediums don't destroy the old ones. They just help them become more of what they could be. But where I want to blend the past and the present, because this week is so huge when it comes to history repeating. And I just can't help myself as a classicist and as someone who loves Homer. I think these epic poems to me are some of the greatest stories ever told. And there's a reason why they have survived, and there's a reason why every generation finds a new way to tell them. And the beauty of Homer's epics is that they were always meant to be interpreted. There's no one set version of the Odyssey. Every translation is an interpretation. So every vase, every theatre production, every translation across languages and centuries is one person or one group of people saying, here is my reading of a story that we all know so well. And this is not deviation from tradition. That in itself is the tradition. The story belongs to whoever is telling it. Nolan is not adapting the Odyssey. He is joining in on the 3,000-year-long conversation about it. And he's doing it with the tools that no one else in these conversations has ever had access to before. So to shoot the film entirely on IMAX, his team had to solve a problem that sounds almost absurd when you first hear of it. So IMAX cameras are enormous, and the film stock is large format, and the mechanism that drives it through the shutter is incredibly loud, apparently. So loud that it would contaminate every audio of every intimate scene that has dialogue. So the solution is a blimp, an acoustic housing that wraps around the camera to silence it. But when you enclose the camera in a blimp, you also make it nearly impossible for actors to maintain eye contact that emotional performances depend on. So if they cannot see each other, they can't really connect. So the team designed a custom 2-mirror periscope system. One actor looks into the lens. The mirrors are then positioned so that the actor's face is reflected perfectly into the space directly behind the lens. Each person is seeing each other. The emotional connection is preserved, and the scene should read intimate on screen, even though it was shot with one of the most loudest, clunkiest, demanding cameras in cinema. But Anne Hathaway described the experience by saying that she's never felt like she was compromising herself to engage within a technical system that placed her performance outside of herself. And she said that every memory that she's had on this set felt normal. And she said it was form following function, and that was the ongoing principle within the system. So the technology was in service of the story, not the other way around. And to get there, they had to invent something new. And this is exactly what Pixar has always done as well. So Steve Jobs purchased the graphics group from Lucasfilms, and it became Pixar. But what people often forget is that Pixar was not first and foremost a film studio. It was a tech company that was just making films in order to prove what it was technologically doing. Toy Story required the invention of rendering software that didn't exist yet. Finding Nemo required the simulation of underwater light behavior and fluid dynamics at a level of complexity the industry just had never attempted before. And every film, in part, was an engineering problem. They were not making films about tech. They were inventing technology in order to make the films that they could imagine. And even now, Andrew Stanton has said publicly that Pixar has always had machine learning in some form, and taking this idea of automating tasks that slow the artist down or no one really wants to do manually. He's been very clear in interviews of late that the goal has always been the same: make it easier on the artist to be artistic, free up the energy and free up the attention and time. Basically to get the technical friction out of the way so that the creative work can be done at the highest level. And this framing matters because it's a very different framing from AI as a replacement replacement. So where are we going next in terms of storytelling? Let's see what my futuristic insights are telling me. So the first thing worth sitting with when it comes to the future of films and storytelling and entertainment is understanding this distinction between what AI can synthesize and what human artists can originate. Because AI in its current state and by fundamental architecture can only recombine and understand what already exists. And it's extraordinarily great at this. It can produce outputs that are technically proficient, stylistically coherent, and statistically plausible given what has come before it. But I don't think it can access the state that the greatest artists describe when they talk about where their work comes from. That place that is outside of logic, outside of the known, where something new enters the world. That almost eureka state. And I don't think this is like a romantic claim about the mysticism of art, but it is a structural observation about what AI actually is and what it actually does. An AI system trained on everything that has ever been created can produce very good work within the envelope of what has existed. But I don't think it can produce work that breaks the envelope. And that work that breaks the envelope are the ones that change everything. But the second insight is about what happens to storytelling when the barriers to creation keep falling. We are already seeing this, but I don't think we have fully processed what it means. So theatre was originally made by the people for the people. It was communal and it was public and it was totally accessible. But then it became institutionalized and a ticket to Broadway now costs hundreds of dollars, but it was so worth it. And cinema democratized the experience of watching stories at scale, but it also introduced gatekeepers. We have studios, distributors, exhibitors, all who controlled what got made and who got to make it. And television brought stories into every home, but the network model meant that everything had to be approved by advertisers. And there was like a whole storyline on Mad Men about it, which was so great to watch. Highly recommend a rewatch of that. But streaming appeared to break that model as well. And in some ways it did. But streaming is now moving back towards advertisements to sustain itself economically. And the consolidation of major platforms is creating new forms of gatekeeping it originally disrupted. And what the internet has actually done, and I think this is the biggest evolution of them all, is that it's making it easier to bypass the gatekeepers entirely. Not to fight the gatekeeper, but to simply just go around them and build direct relationships with your own audience. And the implication for the future of entertainment is huge. The most important creative careers of the next 20 years won't necessarily belong to people who got signed by a studio or cast by a network. I believe that they'll belong to people who built something, a body of work, a community, and a creative voice. Those who found an audience that was waiting for them. And Steven Spielberg, you know I love him, in a recent interview said something that really stayed with me. He told people to pick up their phones and just start making things. Just start. The technology, the distribution, and the audience are all there waiting for you. You just have to do it. And the third insight is about what audiences actually want and how that's changing. And there is good evidence here that I find quite hopeful that audiences are becoming more discerning and not less. So the era of passive consumption, of turning something on and just watching it without real engagement, is not where momentum is anymore. People are increasingly seeking stories that stay with them, that change something in how they see the world or themselves, that they feel like they were made by someone who actually had something to say. Fear and conflict and shock value have always been reliable tools for holding attention. They are neurologically effective, but they are not what people remember. And they are not what builds a kind of deep audience relationship that sustains a creative career or a cultural institution over time. The entertainment that endures is almost always the entertainment that made people feel something true. And the fourth insight connects to a little bit more of an anthropological perspective, which is that science fiction has always functioned as almost like a rehearsal space for the future. Think about Steven Spielberg with Artificial Intelligence, the movie. Crazy. So the stories a culture tells about what is coming is not always neutral. They shape what gets imagined as possible, what gets funded, and what gets built. And I think you can notice this pattern, but the scientists and engineers who built the technologies that define our current era are frequently citing specific films and books as the things that made them believe the work was worth doing. So science fiction doesn't just reflect the future, I also think it participates in creating it, which is why I always reference movies, guys. So if we're going to move into an era where entertainment is increasingly exploring human potential, consciousness, purpose, and what it means to be alive at this moment of civilization, I think there are real signs that we are. Then the stories being told now are shaping the future that we're building. And I don't think that's a small responsibility. But then our fifth and final insight is about immersive experience and where that medium is heading. So we've talked a lot over the years about VR and AI as being a very transformative entertainment medium, but the technology has often fallen short in terms of its ambition. But the trajectory, I think, is really clear with it. I do think we're moving towards experiences where the distinction between watching a story and being inside it is meaningful. So interactive storytelling, participatory narrative experiences that are personalized without losing a sense of shared cultural moments are really interesting and I think are worth looking at. So these are engineering problems that are being worked on today, and the engineering problems of this kind tend to get solved. But the question worth asking is not whether this technology will arrive. I think it's what stories will we choose to tell when it finally does. Okay, so there's so much to this topic, and I don't think I touched on everything. So let's bring it all in today and see what actions we can do to build this future of entertainment. For individuals, the most important thing you can do right now is post the weird thing. Make the thing that is yours, not the thing that you think will perform or be received well or be understood immediately. And I say this not as creative advice, but very direct experience. My friends and I, as I said, have spent years creating short movies, submitting them to festivals, not because we thought that they were good, but because we wanted to do it and we wanted to see if we could. And I learned so much from that process. Vincent van Gogh also only sold one painting in his lifetime, just one. But the impact of creative work doesn't always arrive in the timeline of the creator. So my mantra forever has always been no expectations. If you have a story, there is an audience waiting to hear it. Maybe it might just be one person, but that one person might be so inspired that they create something else. And isn't that great impact? But for builders and founders, the frame that Pixar has always used is worth studying carefully. They were a tech company that did not set out to make technology. They set out to tell stories, and they built the technology those stories required. If you're working in any part of the creative tech space, be that with production tools, distribution platforms, AI creative tools, or immersive experiences, the question to keep returning to is whether what you're building makes it easier for the artist to be an artist, not easier for a non-artist to produce content at scale. Those are two very different products with two very different implications. The ones that will matter in 20 years will be the ones that will amplify true creative intelligence, not the ones that root around it. And for organizations, the entertainment industry's economic disruption is not a story about technology defeating incumbents. I think it's a story about what happens when distribution becomes decentralized and community becomes an asset. The organizations that are navigating this well are the ones that have been built with audiences who truly care about them, not as a distribution channel, but as a creative entity with a voice and a perspective. And that applies whether you are a film studio or a broadcaster, an independent production company, or a brand that creates content as part of how it engages with the world. So fame is a resource, and the question is how it is being invested. But there is a thread in everything that we have covered today that I don't think we've fully pulled on completely, and I think it points to the next conversation. So we have talked about what entertainment is and what it is becoming. What we haven't talked about is what is it for? And not in the commercial sense, but in the civilizational sense. What role does storytelling play in how a society processes change? How does a culture that is moving faster than it can integrate, technologically, socially, and ecologically, how can that use a narrative to make sense of itself? And that's a different episode, and I think that's one I actually really do want to do a deep dive on. So I haven't seen the Odyssey yet. I will be doing that as soon as it's out in New Zealand, and I look forward to sharing my interpretation of Christopher Nolan's interpretation at some point in the future. So what is the future of entertainment and film? I think we're about to hit a new renaissance when it comes to film and storytelling, and I want to bring back Hedy Lamarr into this and remind you that you can hold both. You can be an inventor and you can be an actress. You can do both things. So if you have a story to tell, I encourage you to share it, because I think the renaissance of the next era is going to be truly for the people, by the people yet again. But I think the giants of Spielberg's and Christopher Nolan's, I think they still have so much gas left in the tank of these true genius storytellers who blend technology and science, the weird kids who know how to tell a story. I think there's something really beautiful in this next era of entertainment and film, and I'm really excited to see what comes next. But if today's episode got you thinking, you can come and join your journey with us. We post nearly every day on Instagram, sharing our insights and inspirations for founders and future-facing leaders. It's a good place to stay curious curious? And if you're ready to go deeper, you can head over to our website at RobinsonHewitt.com. We work at the intersection of anthropology, emerging technology, and long-term systems change, helping future-facing leaders, businesses, organizations, and founders transform, evolve, and build the next era. If you're still orienting, we have so many free resources available online to help you with your own founder's journey. But if you're ready to take the leap, you can check out our services as well. Make sure to subscribe to help build a better future for everybody. Everything is linked below, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao.